There was a man in Israel who did not seem like a hero. His name was Gideon, and his story began quietly, not on the battlefields, but inside a wine press, a tank dug into the ground used to press grapes. There, he secretly threshed wheat, trying to deceive the Midianites who, for 7 years, had been plundering and humiliating the people. It was a time when even harvesting one's own food was a risky act. The scene is curious. A man, hidden, fighting fear and hunger, trying to protect what little dignity he had left. And it is at this very moment of fragility that something extraordinary happens. An angel of the Lord appears and calls him a mighty man. Mighty? The word seems out of place. Gideon did not wield a sword. He did not lead anyone. He was just hiding. And perhaps that was the first miracle in his story, being called for what he was not yet. Subscribe to the channel and discover curiosities, hidden facts, and profound truths about the characters in the Bible. Turn on the bell and follow each new video. What few realize is that this encounter reveals the heart of God. He does not see what we are, but what we can be under his voice. Gideon, surrounded by fear, represented the portrait of an entire nation, a people who still believed in God, but had already forgotten how to trust. Fear had become the language of a generation. As the angel speaks, Gideon responds with honesty and pain. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? It was the silent cry of someone tired of waiting. And yet God does not rebuke him. He simply says, "Go in this strength of yours." As if to say, the strength you have is enough, because it is in your weakness that I will act. This is the divine irony of the story. God chooses the insecure to lead, the hidden to liberate, the weak to conquer. Gideon did not yet understand, but that call at the winepress was the beginning of a spiritual revolution, one that would begin within him before reaching the battlefield. And as the wind stirred the dust of the winepress, the fearful man began to realize that something greater was about to happen. Fear still accompanied him, but the voice that called him began to echo louder than his insecurity. Before continuing, I want to invite you to comment on which city or country you are watching from. Let's see how far this message is reaching. Gideon's days were marked by silence and despair. Israel lived under the weight of Midianite oppression, a cruel rule that devastated the country like a swarm of locusts. The enemies came every year at harvest time to steal the fruit of the Israelites' labor. Nothing was spared, not wheat, not cattle, not hope. Villages hid in mountain caves, and once fertile fields became synonymous with frustration and fear. It was the price of disobedience. After the deaths of Deborah and Barak, the people turned away from the Lord once again. The cycle repeated itself: sin, oppression, crying out, and deliverance. But this time, the cry was slow in coming. The people had grown accustomed to fear. They no longer expected a miracle. They were just trying to survive. The promises of a land of plenty seemed like distant stories told by the elders around the fire. Historically, the Midianites were not an organized army, but nomadic tribes from the eastern desert. They used fast, violent, and unpredictable tactics. They invaded by surprise and disappeared before there was any response. Chaos was constant, and it was in this environment that Gideon was born, in a generation that knew only scarcity and shame. Religious practices were also corrupt. Altars to Baal and idol poles took the place of the true God. The heart of Israel was divided between fear and idolatry, between the memory of the God who freed their fathers and the seduction of the false promises of foreign gods. Instead of crying out in faith, the people only murmured. It is in this scenario of moral and spiritual ruin that Gideon's call makes sense. He did not arise in times of glory, but at the height of decay. It was as if God were saying, even when all seems lost, there is still a remnant that I can raise up. Gideon represented that remnant. Someone small, hidden, but with a heart willing to listen. While Israel looked to the heavens waiting for a savior, God looked at the winepress and saw a deliverer. The story that was about to unfold would not only be a military victory, but a restoration of faith. And before the trumpets sounded, the first battlefield would be within Gideon's own heart. Gideon was the son of Joash from the tribe of Manasseh, one of the least significant tribes of Israel. He lived in Ophrah, a small rural town far from the political and religious center of the country. His family was modest and, in his own words, the least in the tribe, which made him an unlikely candidate for any leadership role. His name, however, carried an omen, Gideon, which means woodcutter or he who cuts, a name that, unbeknownst to him, already announced his mission to cut the roots of idolatry and pave the way for a new faith. When the angel of the Lord found him, he was threshing wheat in a winepress, an inappropriate place for such a task. This simple detail reveals a lot. The winepress was closed, stuffy, small, but it offered a hiding place. Inside, Gideon hid more than wheat. He hid fear, mistrust, and perhaps the last spark of hope. Then the divine voice breaks the silence. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." It was a phrase that sounded like a paradox. Gideon, surprised, responds honestly, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" These words, more than doubt, reveal a wounded soul. He did not doubt God's existence. He doubted his presence. It was the portrait of a man who believed but saw no answers. And it is precisely this type of person that God chooses, those who still speak to him, even when all seems lost. The angel does not correct him, does not rebuke him. He simply commissions him. Go in this your strength, a strength that did not come from courage, but from sincerity. Gideon, confused, tries to argue. He recalls his insignificance, his lack of resources, his small family. But God responds with a promise that would echo throughout his journey. "I will be with you." It was enough. The divine presence would replace everything he thought he lacked. At that moment, the winepress became an altar. Gideon realized that the encounter was not a visit, it was a calling. A calling that did not depend on titles, lineage, or bravery, but on a willingness to obey. From then on, the woodcutter would become a liberator. But before facing armies, he would need to face something much more difficult, the fear that lived within him. Before leading an army, Gideon had to fight a war within himself and within his own home. God's call had taken him from the winepress, but it had not yet taken the fear from his heart. The man who had heard the divine voice still wondered if it was all real, so he asked for signs. Not once, but several times. The first was the fire that consumed the offering on the rock. Later came the famous test of the fleece, one night with dew on the wool and another with the wool dry and the ground wet. These signs were not mere whims. They were cries from a soul that wanted to believe, but still trembled. Gideon did not doubt God. He doubted himself. And God patiently answered each request. He knew that faith is not born ready-made. It is built step by step, sign after sign. But the real test was yet to come. The first challenge was not in the field of the Midianites, but in his own backyard. That night, God commanded, "Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the idol pole beside it." It was a bold act, not only against idolatry, but against his own family and village. Gideon obeyed, but he did it at night, for fear of the men of the city. Still, he did it. And that is the difference between the coward and the brave. The coward lets fear decide. The brave obeys in spite of it. When morning came, the altar was destroyed, and the people were enraged. They wanted him dead. But Joash, his father, surprisingly defended him, saying, "If Baal is a god, let him fight for himself." That morning marked the beginning of the transformation. Gideon was no longer the hidden man. He was now the man who had stood up against the sin of his own house. Before he could free Israel from its external enemies, he had to free his soul from its internal gods. Fear still existed, but now it walked alongside obedience. And for the first time, Gideon began to understand. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to follow God's voice, even while trembling. The overturned altar would be the first public sign that something new was emerging in Israel. And from then on, The call of the winepress would begin to echo throughout the nation. If this content is touching your heart, you can support this project by donating any amount by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. Your support helps me to continue telling these stories with dedication. The time for war had come. The neighboring tribes, the Midianites, Amalekites, and peoples of the east gathered together like a swarm and camped in the valley of Jezreel. They were countless, like locusts, says the text. Gideon, now well known, gathered the people and blew the trumpet. 32,000 men responded to the call. It was a significant number, but God had other plans. The Lord looked at that army and declared something that sounded illogical. There are too many people. Gideon must have been astonished. How could there be too many people in such a large crowd? But God explained, if they win like this, Israel will boast, saying, "My own strength saved me." Then began the strangest selection process in military history. First, the fearful were dismissed. 22,000 returned home. 10,000 remained. Still, God said, "There are still too many," and he took them to the stream. There, a simple test of how they would drink water separated the chosen ones. Only 300 men who brought the water to their mouths with their hands remained. The rest were sent back, from 32,000 to 300, a reduction that defied human logic. What many failed to realize is that this sieve was not about strength, but about faith. Gideon needed to understand that victory would come from dependence, not quantity. It was a painful lesson for someone who had already doubted so much. That night, before the battle, fear returned, and God, knowing his heart, did not rebuke him. He gave him an unexpected gift. Go down to the camp of the Midianites, and you will hear what they are saying. Gideon went silently and listened to two enemies talking. One recounted a dream. He saw a loaf of barley bread rolling through the camp and destroying the tents of Midian. The other interpreted, "This is the sword of Gideon, the deliverer of Israel." Those words, coming from the mouths of his enemies, set his spirit on fire. Gideon fell down and worshipped. Fear turned into faith. It was the turning point. The man who doubted now believed. With 300 men, clay jars, lit torches and trumpets, he marched toward the impossible. And the following night would become one of the most surprising victories in biblical history, where God's power would be revealed through human frailty. The dawn was silent when Gideon's 300 men surrounded the enemy camp. Each carried a trumpet, a clay jar, and a torch hidden inside it. No shields, no swords, only faith, and a plan that, humanly speaking, seemed suicidal. But what Gideon had learned was simple. When God is the one who provides the strategy, logic loses its meaning. At the agreed-upon signal, the trumpets sounded at the same time. The sound echoed through the hills of Jezreel like thunder from heaven. The jars were broken, revealing the light of the torches, and everyone shouted, "Sword of the Lord and of Gideon!" The noise, the light, and the shouting created complete chaos. The Midianites, seized with terror, began to fight each other. Amid the darkness and confusion, the enemy destroyed itself. What happened that night was more than a military victory. It was a spiritual revelation. God showed Israel that human strength is limited, but obedience can move the impossible. No Israelite warrior raised a sword, yet the war was won. The battle that began in the winepress with one hidden and uncertain man now ended in the glow of victorious torches. The echo of that triumph spread throughout the land. Tribes that had previously remained silent joined in the pursuit of their enemies. Fear, once widespread, turned to courage, and the name of Gideon, the man who doubted, became a symbol of faith in action. But there was something deeper going on. The broken pitcher, the hidden light, the collective cry, all were spiritual symbols. The pitcher represented human frailty, the light, the power of God within imperfect vessels. For the light to shine, the pitcher had to be broken. Likewise, Gideon had to be broken inside for God to shine through him. The battlefield became an invisible altar where human glory was set aside, and the name of the Lord was exalted. The fear that had once dominated the hearts of Israel was replaced by reverence. Gideon was now not only a deliverer, but living proof that faith, when obedient, can turn the impossible into victory. After the great victory, Israel breathed a sigh of relief. The Midianites were defeated, and Gideon's name spread throughout the nation as that of a hero. But as so often in biblical history, glory is a dangerous flame. It warms, but it can also burn. And it was in the glow of his conquest that the shadows of his downfall began. The people, enchanted by Gideon's leadership, wanted to crown him. "Rule over us, you and your son's son," they asked. It seemed like a fair honor, but Gideon refused. "The Lord will rule over you." His words were correct, but his heart quietly began to stray in another direction. He asked the Israelites for the gold earrings taken from their enemies, and with them built an ephod, a priestly garment that was supposed to represent God's presence. However, that object became something more. Israel began to worship it. What was born as a reminder of victory became a trap of idolatry. The symbol of faith became a symbol of deviation. The biblical text is direct. All Israel prostituted themselves there after it. And the man who had torn down the altar of Baal in his youth now saw another altar rise, built by his own hands. It is a sad irony. The liberator of Israel ended up trapped by the same weakness that had freed others. In addition, Gideon had many wives and children, 70 in all, and even a concubine in Shechem, who bore him Abimelech, the son who would later bring tragedy to his house. The heart of the judge, who had once been humble and God-fearing, began to be divided between the memory of victory and the weight of fame. In the silence of his final years, Gideon saw the people drift away again. Perhaps he felt the weight of a cycle that seemed never-ending, and although peace lasted 40 years during his lifetime, there was a subtle sadness behind the tranquility, the pain of realizing that even after so many victories, the human heart was still the greatest battlefield. The warrior who had faced armies now faced the bitter echo of the consequences of his own choices, and that would be the quietest and most painful struggle of his life. After the war and the glory came silence. Gideon grew old in Ophrah, his hometown, surrounded by children, memories, and a people who were once again distancing themselves from God. There is no record of great speeches or heroic final acts, just the ordinary life of a man who carried victories and regrets. And perhaps therein lies his redemption, in the quiet recognition that everything he experienced only had meaning because the Lord was with him. Despite his mistakes, Gideon never claimed the throne. He did not build palaces, impose laws, or proclaim himself king. He refused titles and lived simply, far from the crowns that the people wanted to give him. This refusal, although incomplete in his spiritual discernment, shows a trace of humility that remained. He knew that true power was not in his hands, but in his submissive heart. The ephod he had created, a symbol of spiritual slippage, became a source of silent repentance. There is no direct mention of confession, but there are indications that Gideon understood his mistake. Unlike Saul, who struggled to justify himself, Gideon accepted oblivion. He lived his last years away from the spotlight, as if he preferred the quiet peace of a man who had experienced both fear and glory. For 40 years, Israel lived in peace. It was the longest period of tranquility since the time of Deborah. This shows that, despite human failings, God honored the faith that was once born in the winepress. Gideon's life is proof that grace is not erased by mistakes. It is only transformed into learning. In his last days, one can imagine that old judge looking at the field where the Midianites once camped. Perhaps he saw there not a memory of victory, but of mercy. For the God who called him in fear was the same God who sustained him with patience. Gideon's triumph is not in a new battle, but in a new understanding. He learned that true triumph is to remain faithful even after the trumpets fall silent. And in that silence God still spoke, no longer with thunder or angels, but with the peace that dwells in the heart of those who, despite their failures, chose to believe. Gideon's last days were marked by tranquility. There were no wars, no visions, no angels, just the quiet of a man who had lived intensely and now watched generations grow up under the fruit of his struggles. Israel had peace for 40 years, a rare legacy among the judges. This peace, however, did not come from the strength of his hands, but from the memory of what God did through an ordinary man. Gideon died at a ripe old age, surrounded by his many children, and was buried in the tomb of Joash, his father, in Ophrah. The Bible recounts this ending briefly, almost discreetly, as if silence were the most fitting tribute to one who began in obscurity. The man who once saw himself as small had become a landmark in the history of a nation. But after his death, Israel's old wound reopened. The people returned to prostituting themselves with the Baals and even erected an idol called Baal-berith, the god of the false covenant. And in a gesture of ingratitude, they forgot the deliverer God had given them. The story of Gideon ends on this bitter note. The people forgot both God and the man through whom God had acted, yet heaven did not forget. Centuries later, Gideon's name would be remembered in the book of Hebrews, among the heroes of faith. There he appears alongside Samson, David, and Samuel, not for his perfection, but for his trust. The mention is short but profound. By faith, they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and obtained promises. Gideon was among them. His legacy was not gold, nor the ephod, nor the number of children. It was the reminder that God can turn fear into courage, doubt into confidence, and the ordinary into the extraordinary. Gideon left no thrones, but he left an example, that of someone who dared to believe even without understanding. He began in hiding and ended forgotten by men, but not by God. And perhaps that is the greatest glory of all, to live in such a way that history need not say much because faith has already spoken for itself. Gideon's story is more than the account of a judge or a warrior. It is a mirror of the human soul in the face of the divine call. He began his journey in hiding, afraid, trying to protect what little hope remained. And it was right there, amid the dust and wheat, that God found him. This reveals something profound. God does not choose those who are ready. He prepares those he chooses. What makes Gideon extraordinary is not his bravery, but his vulnerability. He doubted, asked for signs, feared, retreated, and yet God remained with him. The message is clear. Heaven does not seek perfection. It seeks sincerity. Gideon showed that true faith is born when fear is placed before God, not when it is denied. The winepress where he hid became a symbol of the spiritual life of many of us. How often do we also try to thresh wheat in inappropriate places, trying to survive, keeping our faith silent, hiding what remains of our courage? And yet, it is in these places of isolation that God's voice often finds us. He still calls ordinary people brave, even when they feel too small to deserve such a title. Gideon's journey also warns us. The greatest victories can become traps if the heart does not remain humble. The golden ephod reminds us that even good intentions can go astray if they are not guided by obedience. The faith that defeats giants is the same faith that must remain vigilant after triumph. But above all, Gideon teaches us about the power of grace. He began fearful and ended in peace. His name was forgotten by men, but remembered by God, and that is enough. The Lord did not measure his faith by his moments of doubt, but by his willingness to continue even while trembling. Gideon's life is an invitation to trust. It is a reminder that God still chooses the unlikely, still transforms the weak into the strong, and still calls those who feel small brave. Because in the end, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to obey, even when fear is still present. If you liked Gideon's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.